Chris Arnade, welcome to The Realignment.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
So, Chris, the reason we wanted to have you on, you're one of these kind of original realignment figures. You spent the last 8 years, you've been chronicling left behind parts of the country, culminating in this book that we have before. It says Dignity, It's Seeking Respect in Back Row America. And we spent a lot of time on the show discussing the regions and the populations that your book chronicles, that you've been talking about on Twitter now for quite some time. Now, I think your background itself is so interesting, and I want to make sure that everybody really understands the genesis of this book. So you were a former Wall Street trader. You're a Johns Hopkins physics PhD. You left your career in 2011 just to interview and photograph left behind people across the country. Tell us a little bit about that experience, what made you decide to do it, and why you started it in 2011. That's not a hot time, if you will, to jump onto the Americans that are being left behind.
Well, maybe
train.
It's a hot time to leave Wall Street, though.
Yeah,
so I guess there's a question about that.
Yeah. It was a hot time to leave Wall Street.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's hard to summarize kind of like why I did what I did. I've been asked that question multiple times. I don't know if I have a good answer other than I was really tired of Wall Street. The financial crisis helped me become even more tired quicker of Wall Street. Not in the ways that kind of are traditional, meaning it didn't impact me personally. I did well during the financial crisis. I wasn't feeling like I had to leave for financial reasons. But prior to the financial crisis, even though I was, I've been banking for 15 years as a bond trader, I think if you had asked me prior to the financial crisis if what I was doing was good or bad, I would have just said neither. It's just benign. But after the financial crisis, I was pretty sure that what we were doing was not good. And I thought other people on Wall Street would have the same epiphany. And very few did. And that was kind of gave me a big distance between me and the industry. I started thinking about the industry very much differently. I started thinking about the way I think very differently. And how we on Wall Street and how a lot of people who are like what I call the front row, elites, into cognitive elites, if you will, how they think about things. They think about things very, very quantitatively, very focused on data. I literally was somebody who for 20 years sat in front of screens looking at blips of data and making bets on it and not really caring about the consequences beyond my bottom line, my pocketbook. And I started to think that the way we thought about the world, how we thought about things just quantitatively through spreadsheets, through PowerPoint presentations was not the right way to think about things, and that probably I needed a different way to think about things, and that was what is basically ethnography, going out and talking to people, getting away from the computer and going out and talking to people and the people impacted by the decisions that we made. And it wasn't as planned as that. It just kind of, that was the evolve. That's how my thinking evolved. It was just, it was also me just wanting, I would go for 20-mile walks, just across
people.
New York City.
Yeah.
And I am a photographer. So, during those walks, I brought my camera and I take pictures of people, and eventually the people, when I took a picture of them, would tell me their stories, and then that became much more interesting.
So something that we talk about in the introduction is the idea that after 2016, it became very cool, very hot to sort of go on safari, to sort of go out into the places that people sort of said were Trump country or rural America. You obviously started this in the early 2010s, so your project was never sort of framed that way, and I doubt you thought of it that way. What do you think distinguishes what you did in terms of taking yourself as a cognitive elite and like going off into places you wouldn't normally go from a lot of sort of post-2016 populism analysis?
It was never planned to be a book. It was never planned to be anything but me thinking about just going out and talking to people. There was no... It started becoming a plan around the election only because the election was out there.
Yeah.
And, some people, cartoonishly say the book is about Trump voters. It's not. It's about non-voters.
Yes.
I mean, it's about people who don't vote. And this project was never about politics. It was always about poverty. It was always about addiction. It was always about listening to people. And it just so happened that the places I went, places that were primarily left behind, depressed, filled with drugs, filled with poverty, were places where Trump was resonating, the white communities, very early. And I kind of accidentally got into politics because, like any, like a lot of front row elites, I was also on Twitter while I was doing this project, and it became this real sense of frustration that I was seeing all these, what I guess are now just dismissively called blue check marks.
Yes.
Having opinions about the election that were just so clearly wrong.
So let's get into this real quick. So you've referenced front row and back row. That's sort of your intellectual construct. Let's tell the viewers about what does that mean? Like, it's a classroom, but let's go into it.
So what I started realizing when I was doing this, and the project began in the Bronx, basically. So in a neighborhood that was 99% Latino.
So not Trump country.
Not Trump country. And
AOC country.
And that's where and that's where I spent 3 years.
Yeah.
It overlapped a little bit with AOC's district, but and it was basically it was on addiction and homelessness. But as I started going beyond the Bronx to Bridgeport, to Portsmouth, Ohio, to all these places, I started realizing that the similarities were very strong between a Bronx and a Portsmouth. I mean, there was racial differences, there was a rural-urban thing, but they were similar, and they were distinct from my old life as a banker in one very important way, which was education, education, education. That the divide I was seeing in the country, and I had this really weird experience of doing this project for 3 years while working on Wall Street, where I was literally during the day trading on Wall Street and at night in crack houses. Right. And so the stark divide I was seeing, I started realizing was, first you see the racial divide, then you see the economic divide, but then I started realizing that the much more important divide, and one that we didn't speak about that much, was education. That the people I, by and large, was spending time with had all similar backgrounds in the sense that they probably didn't go to college. And if they did go to college, it was a community college. And if they did do anything after that, it might have been a trade school. And it might have been maybe University of Alabama eventually. Mm-hmm. And all the people who were yelling at me on Twitter or my banker friends had all done this, were racially diverse, come from India, come from Uganda, from Brazil, but they all had a similar background as well, which is they all had gone to Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Cornell, and had a very similar experience post high school. And that divide was much stronger, as strong as the other divides I was seeing in the country. And so I came up with a quip that the bankers, the lawyers, the blue check marks were the front row, and the people I was spending time with were the back row.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's an interesting construct. What it is really a story about class, is what you're saying there, and it's beyond that. But I wonder, is it David Good? Is it Goodyear?
David Goodhart.
Goodhart. He has this this term, somewheres and anywheres. Why front row versus back row? Somewhere and anywhere.
Specify what somewhere and
somewhere and anywhere is very much like somewhere is somebody who's rooted within a community and has distinct ties and maybe a nationality, and an anywhere is a rootless cosmopolitan elite. I think J.D. Vance likes to tell us, he was our first episode of the podcast. Go back and listen to that if you haven't. In which some person in New York City might feel more comfortable having dinner with somebody in France than they would somebody from West Virginia, despite the fact that the West Virginian might be his own countryman. So what front row and back row specifically, was it just something that you found is purely a product of education, or is it the class story? What is it about that really resonates with you?
I think the education is what forms the root of all those other things.
Okay.
So education comes first in the sense that amongst the educated elite, the front row, and that was my old life. That was my Wall Street life. That was my PhD in physics life, are just as comfortable in Mayfair, England, as they are in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Not Manhattan. They're not comfortable in Harlem. They're comfortable in Soho.
Yes.
So it's very, very local. And so the problem with when people talk about I spent 3 years with the Bronx. That's 15 minutes from the Upper East Side. Mm-hmm. That is not the urban elite.
No, it's not. Yeah.
So it's very, very micro local, and so it's not geographical, because again, I think somebody I think a half Dominican, half Puerto Rican kid who grows up in the South Bronx has a lot more in similarity with a white kid from Portsmouth, Ohio, than they do to a bond trader
Yes.
in Harlem in Manhattan. And I think the bond trader in Harlem has more in common with the professor of sociology at Princeton, because their worldview is very similar. Now, when you talk about the somewhere versus nowhere, I get into that in my book when I talk about one of the things that distinguishes the people in the front row, i.e. the educated elite, is that they really don't have a sense of place. Place is just something you dispense with when necessary.
Yes.
to move on in your career, just like I did. As you know, I moved multiple times in my life, and I would do it again.
And all of us have.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And whereas in the back row, one of the things, I spent a lot of time in the book in places like New York City. And one thing that fascinates me, you can go to the outer boroughs of New York City. You can go to some place like Diker Heights. You can go across the river here in D.C. to East D.C. and you'll find people who don't leave their neighborhood. Who, there are people in Diker Heights who haven't gone in, quote, into Manhattan in 20 years. So there are people who live locally in urban settings.
Yeah.
But the living, what it means to be kind of place matters to you. So one of the things that fascinated me when I was, when it struck me was on about my, 1,000th interview. When I would say to somebody like, "Why didn't you move?" And they look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what do you mean? Why would I move? Like, everything is here. Or I would say to somebody, I'll be interviewing them, wrapping up the interview. So I said, "Let me get this right. So you've lived here all your life?" They go, "No, I haven't lived here all life." He goes, I grew up 15 miles down the road. Now I live here.
Right.
Yeah. I'm like, I'm from Oregon. That's what I mean by you moved.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, it just struck me as like the sense of place is so important. And one of the things I get back in the book is I build it out a little bit more in what I call place. I guess what's his name? Goodwin? Goodhart calls it the somewheres. People who have a large sense of place, that's what I call a non-credential form of meaning. That's something that's gifted to you at birth. It's non-economic. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to have a resume. And so those things are. There are three of those things that I document in the book of being extraordinarily important to the back row: faith, place, and the one that's very touchy is race.
Yeah.
Racial identity. Those all don't require credentials, and by and large, the front row doesn't value them as much as the back row does. And the problem with that is when you devalue those things, that's very elitist because it takes away things that we give basically poor people.
Yeah.
So why would you say they devalue them?
Because because education is all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
And education matters because for gaining wealth. It's all about getting wealth. It's all about material forms of possessions. It's at its core, it's a materialism dressed up in this kind of faux meritocracy that it says that the way you get more things is if you have more education.
So you said the word, now there's like an alarm going off somewhere, meritocracy, right? Yeah. So the sort of pushback to what the story you just told is that, we could attack the meritocracy and we could say that credentialism and education are problematic, but the educational system we have now is what enables someone from, the back row who's born in a rural part of the country to work hard and, get educated, then move, and then participate in this system.
Like me.
Yeah. So like that's, so how do we balance those two things, right?
Yeah. I mean, and so there's a lot of great things about the current system, right? It's well-intended.
Yeah.
I actually, where I differ from a lot of critics of it is I think that people who, I don't have any problems with the front row. I think by and large, I know them very well. I'm one myself. But I spent 20 years, working with the frontists of the front rows. They're well-intended people. They actually think they're doing the right thing. But my problem is I don't believe they understand. So going back to the introductions, like when I started doing these things, started getting out there and talking to people, started arguing with people on Twitter, I started realizing how much the front row doesn't get that there are huge problems in the back in these poor communities. And so despite their good intentions, they don't know how much damage is being done because they don't see it. And so we talk about the meritocracy, but you only celebrate the people who succeed. You don't see the people who fail.
So let's get into that. Let's further delve into the psyches of front row people. You say they don't really know what they're doing. I think if you're sort of saying, let's say you're a Harvard law grad who, works at a good firm in DC and you do pro bono work, you would say, no, I support, increasing aid to education. I support, They would say that they're not doing anything that holds people down.
That we have one pathway to success. One.
So this is the system you support then.
One pathway to success. And you have to get on. It's like an escalator that goes up really quick. Mm-hmm. And if you don't get on at 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, start building your resume, you're screwed. And when you hang out in the South Bronx, when you hang out in a barrio in El Paso, when you hang out in north side of Cleveland, north side of Milwaukee, or Plattsburgh, New York, and you see people who haven't gone onto that escalator early, they're screwed because the front row only knows one level of success. In many cases, it's a very patriarchal and patronizing way of thinking about things. It's saying to people, I did it. This is what's successful for me. You need to do it. Mm-hmm. As opposed to saying, maybe you don't want to do it. Maybe you don't want to be somebody who spends their nights reading books. Maybe you don't want to be somebody who builds a resume, hops from job to job. Maybe you want to stay in your town, build your family, look at the mountains outside your, and celebrate.
Go to a minor league baseball game.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's a very narrow definition of success that not everybody is mentally built for. That's just not who they are. Mm-hmm. Or people don't want that. And so it's akin to when people go into a poor neighborhood and patronizingly say, how can I help you? Or, not saying how can I help you, saying, I'm going to help you do it this way, and you need to do it, as opposed to just listen. And maybe they don't want to go. Maybe they don't want to move and go to Princeton, Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I always think about, and I mentioned in the book, is this young Mexican American woman. She's 18, 19, 17, and she was sitting in the McDonald's in East LA, and I spent a lot of time in McDonald's, and we can get in that later. But I'm in this McDonald's writing up my notes, and and she's there for the same reason I see a lot of people in McDonald's. She's too poor to have Wi-Fi at home. So she goes at night, does her homework, plays on her Game Boy, just basically spends 5 hours a night at McDonald's. And she eventually talked to me, and I said, well, I'm from New York. And she goes, oh, I love New York. I want to go. I said, well, you're going to college. Yeah. She goes, yeah, I really, but I said, you can go to, she goes, but I can't. I have to stay here. I'm like, why do you have to stay here? She goes, well, I'm my mom's translator. Like, her mom's the first. Yeah. And as a lot of immigrant families know, the oldest kid is the one who ends up being bilingual and does everything. And so again, like, why shouldn't we value that as much? Is that person a failure? The young woman who stays home, stays in her town and bypasses educational opportunities to be a part of the family. And then, of course, on the flip side, there are those kids who are tasked with being the adult in the family. That's true in a lot of South Bronx neighborhoods where the kid is the one who at age 8 and 9 has to make sure the mom appears at the court date, has to make sure the bill is paid so their electricity will be pulled off because the mom might be having a problem with drugs, or the stepdad don't even want to know what's going on there. So there's a lot of kids who don't necessarily want to do this, but also just can't.
So, Chris, what you're saying very much is articulating just how out of step the life of back row America is from the conception of front row. 2016, and I think the realignment, what we talk about here, is the reckoning of the front row with the election, right? And so what the themes behind that election told the front row and their grappling of it. So you're a very astute observer of the back row, but turn your eye now to the front. How has the front row grappled with 2016? Have they learned any of the right lessons? I mean, are you encouraged? Are you discouraged? More encouraged today than you were in 2011, or more discouraged?
It actually reminds me a lot of the financial crisis because that's why I giggle, because when the financial crisis happened, there was a set of us on Wall Street who were kind of like saying, this looks like it could end badly.
Could end badly. Yeah.
This over over quants, too much quantization, and I got a PhD in physics. So,
And what's the quant stuff?
Sorry.
What's the quant sort of focus?
Just complex financial products that people are selling that people don't understand, shoving it down their throats. That could all end badly. This leveraged 45-1. When it did end badly, some of us looked around and goes, "Oh, okay, well, the gig's up. Like these people, everybody will figure it out, and we'll change." And of course, nobody changed.
Yeah.
People put their head in the sand and just simply said, "What? We didn't mess up. What do you mean? We didn't mess up? It was those poor people who borrowed money. How dare them?" So there was no lessons learned from the financial crisis, and that was part of my distancing from the financial crisis. Prior to the election, when I kind of said, I think Trump has a chance here, I got made fun of, which is fine. And then there are people out there who were like, "Oh no, it's the chances of Trump winning is as much. If Trump wins, I'll eat a bug."
0%. Yeah, right. Huffington Post 99% chance.
But just arrogance,
Right.
including
Yes.
the Clinton campaign,
Yeah.
which cost an election. But it's the same doubling down. They're in denial of what happened. A few people have, changed, but in general they're in denial. And it reminds me so much of the why. I mean, one of the dirty secrets of the financial crisis is the people most responsible for the financial crisis did the best out of it. Personally, they made the most money. Similarly, I think the people who got the 2016 election the wrongest are doing pretty well now.
Disagree.
So
That's the Trump bump at a major media publication.
But the lessons that I think, I would hope, should be is humility, is this recognition that, look, we're sheltered, we're sheltered, we're smart, but we're smart in one direction, which is generally a data approach, quantitative, a positivistic approach. Expertise is a sham. And
what makes you say that? I think that's what irks, I think, front row America the most. They're like, well, I have a PhD and so. I've been studying this for 25 years. Who are you to come and tell me that I don't know anything?
There are places you have to be very careful about. There are technical fields where expertise clearly matters.
Yes.
Like
Physics.
Yeah.
But it depends the context.
Better for me is
Building airplanes, right?
It's just auto mechanics, right?
Yeah, auto
Like you want somebody who knows what part goes where.
Right.
And that requires somebody who studies that. I don't know about foreign policy, man. Foreign policy is not something where you need to be an expert, and it's not technically. It's not a technical field. It's more of a bullshit field.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's similar. You have to be very careful where to draw the line between. It's that I remember after the election when, everybody smugly did the cartoon about the guy flying the airplane. Remember that one on the New Yorker cartoon about it was supposed to show about how experts matter. But again, that's a very different thing. A pilot is an expert. That's a very technical field versus a much more nuanced field that's not technical, like foreign policy, like political science, like philosophy, like things that where you're talking, basically anything where you talk about large-scale behavior of humans, we don't know anything really well.
So this is all useful because I think we're talking about the front row, but actually the front row is sort of diverse in the sort of sectors we're talking about because we focused on Wall Street, we focused on big law, DC, East Coast, but up on the West Coast you have the tech sector, which if we're talking about, because if I'm a techie, right, I hear you say college is outmoded, it's this sort of like one way up path. There are plenty of people and ex-Googlers, Facebook, Amazon say, "Oh yeah, totally. Our established institutions no longer work, so we don't actually think that there's a problem on our end." So what does the sort of like tech front row get wrong?
I don't know technology very well, and so I'm very careful not to talk about it too much.
Yeah.
But I think again, where there's the expertise issue, which I have very strong opinions on. But then there's the issue of, and I think the bigger issue, and this is where I think the front row is really well-intentioned, just doesn't get it. One of the things I keep saying about my book, after 7 years of spending time, a lot of people, and especially on the left, don't understand the lived realities of the people they're advocating for. So that's where I think when tech people get it wrong, I think it's there, which is they see when they extrapolate beyond their field, they see people as these
units,
widgets that can
right.
basically be moved around, and people aren't that.
Yeah.
So it goes back. It's kind of how my critique of UBI is. You don't understand humans if you think UBI is going to work.
Let's explain what UBI is.
Universal basic income.
Yeah, right.
Because it doesn't address what I think is a much deeper issues. It's not just about money. It's about being valued. It's about feeling feeling social, feeling a valued member of society. And UBI doesn't do anything to address that.
But couldn't it be argued, to speak up for the UBI fans who are listeners, can it be argued that the whole point of UBI isn't that it's going to replace meaning and family, but it provides a floor? It says that, look, like, I'm all for replacing the, I'm all for UBI in practice in the sense of a lot of our social safety net should be replaced by just giving people $2,000 a month in their checking account and just be over with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of this myriad, that's the other thing you learn about poverty, the myriad of dumb rules that exist. The bureaucracy is just, it harms poor people. And that's another example where I talk about the front row not understanding the back row. The lived realities of the people they're trying to advocate for. And again, they come from a good place. I don't want to yell at your front row listeners, but they don't understand how poor people live. In aggregate, there's many front row people who do.
So let's be fair here. So let me
let me give the example of that. And it fits with my book is McDonald's, which is
we were going to get there. Don't worry.
Okay, but it's a McDonald's test. How do you see McDonald's? A lot of people in the front row, especially on the left, mock McDonald's as being all those things: unhealthy, blah blah blah, bad for the environment, bad for blank. But it's essential to poor people, and that's one of my books points out is it's as part of a lived reality of a poor person. You're a lot of times in McDonald's.
The subtext, before we move on to Sagar's point, the subtext of a lot of our conversation has been about how left-leaning liberal elites in coastal urban regions get a lot of these things wrong. How do you think the right, sort of like, how do conservatives conceive of a lot of these communities in the wrong way? It's a great question.
Again, my critique has generally been more of the left, even though I'm on the left, and that's because I think it's clear what the critique of the right is, which is it's libertarianism. It's not talk about treating people as widgets, treating labor as widgets. just the whole dismissal of people's right as workers, the whole idea of putting profits first, the whole kind of predatory capitalism that I think the worst example of modern predatory capitalism can be embodied in Mitt Romney, who oddly a lot on the left kind of like, but his form of capitalism of basically adding no value other than extracting profits from companies by destroying any culture they have and any non-economic value they add, and just treating them like things on a spreadsheet to be kind of stripped of any humanity and turned into money. I mean, that's the right.
And so when we're talking about
McDonald's, and then as somebody who grew up in the South in the 60s and 70s, the whole civil rights issue,
right?
That whole thing.
Yeah, that whole thing is pretty central. Yeah. Because if you look at the coalitions now, they're not dissimilar to the civil rights coalitions. The Republicans as being anti-civil rights, and the Democrats as being the civil rights coalition of educated whites and minorities.
So I want to turn to this McDonald's thing. I mean, it's one of the things you're most famous for, which is you're going to McDonald's and kind of evangelizing for it as a central place and a community gathering. First, just speak to that, but I also want to get to. I mean, we talk a lot about trade and China, and these things can be highly, they're highly abstract. But maybe talk more about how a person who may know nothing about NAFTA, the rules of NAFTA, and the arbitration rules within TPP can be so viscerally against these multilateral trade agreements, and just explain where that might come from.
Right.
As a foreign policy.
As a foreign policy, yeah, right.
I can explain as somebody who knows all the rules why I'm against it, but I'll explain. So I don't even know how to begin this one. This is so. One of the things I learned from listening was the front row does the well actually all the time. I call it the well actually. So they'll go into a community. So then I was that person when I went into these communities. I would go in and inevitably I was always in a McDonald's because when you go into these communities, one of the few functional places is the McDonald's. It's not only functional, it's sought after. I call it the community center, the town center for many places. Gary, Indiana, a place I document in a book, 98% African-American community, probably 70% African-American community. Been made the butt of jokes for 30, 40 years since white flight.
Right.
The McDonald's is a vibrant community center where people go to play dominoes, they go to hang out, they go to make friends, they go to wash up, they go maybe to shoot up. There's a lot going on in the McDonald's. And because it's one of the few places that doesn't have any rules about just accepting people on their own terms. And it's also a place you can charge your Wi-Fi, you can use Wi-Fi, you can charge your phone, you can clean up in the bathroom, you can get an inexpensive meal. I mean, try being a vegetarian in Gary, Indiana. You end up, it's an expensive habit to have. It's nice, but it's expensive. Right. And the reality is you're going to end up eating Big Macs from the 2 for $5 special. But McDonald's is essential to these communities because so much is left. And so when I'm in these McDonald's, and it's one of the few places standing. It's like the last man standing in so many communities where you can have a sense of community. And inevitably, not far from the McDonald's, maybe literally adjacent, like it is in Milwaukee, there'll be empty fields with barbed wire, or maybe an old boarded-up warehouse, like in Danville, Virginia. And inevitably, you'll be talking to people, like I did on that. And inevitably, they'll say something like, when did this? When that factory left. Point to the empty lot, and I'd say, like, when did it leave? Well, after NAFTA, or in the 90s, or maybe 80s. And then if I say longer, I'll talk about my career and about TARP.
And this is really huge because I want Sagar to come in on this. We've talked in previous shows, the debate about why these institutions, these factories, these farms left is actually a huge one because it's not just about debating the 70s and 80s. It actually sort of determines what our sort of diagnosis and moving forward looks like, right? Because if this is trade policy, which you've spoken about, or if this is sort of automation.
You don't have that. Those conversations never come up in the McDonald's because what happens is they'll just simply, and I'll be that person. Yeah. I'll be that person who, if they say, I'll say, actually, NAFTA's good.
Did I actually on the show?
It's actually, it's cheaper for you to buy a TV at Walmart. Yes. So aren't you happy?
Yeah, but we're actually, there's more growth going on now in Portland or New York City. So you should just get up and move, and in aggregate, everybody's better. Yeah. But eventually, you just stop saying that because you realize you're an idiot. Because you're sitting there, and at town after town after town, you're seeing the losses. You're seeing those things we did when we implemented NAFTA, when we said there were going to be losses that were going to be small compared to the gains. The gains are going to be big, the losses are going to be small. So the sum of the two is going to be positive. But what people didn't understand about the losses, or didn't want to understand about the losses, it's not just about jobs. It's about the whole town imploding. It's about when the jobs go, people can't form families. When they can't form families, they have kids out of wedlock. When they have kids out of wedlock, there's blah, blah, blah. I'm okay for having kids out of wedlock. Stop jumping. People who are going to listen to this are going to jump on me. But you have the falling apart of these institutions. You have hope leaving, and in comes drugs. And the whole way of life of these people has been destroyed. So it's not just a loss of a job. The loss of a job cascades into a loss of a community. And so why can't they see it? They can't see it because, they've lost their life. They've lost their whole community. And so it's easy to scapegoat to turn and say, why is the factory gone? Why, and then when they hear I'm a banker and we bailed ourselves out, I had 7 or 8 people turn to me why didn't you bail us out when our factory left? Which is the right question to ask. Yeah. And so when I get to the discussion with the front row about this, what frustrates me is there's a sense of over-analysis of it, which is, technologies marches on. What can we do? Which is the only time Front Row ever shrugs its shoulders about anything and treats it as inevitable.
Our degree is to do everything but that.
Yes, exactly. we can policy our way out of anything except for this technological advancement that caused all these factories to leave and people who aren't us to lose their jobs. That one. But in terms of so the other thing is what frustrates me about the dialogue in politics is a lot of people don't care. And they don't need to care. They shouldn't need to care about politics. And, I'm going to get yelled at like, it's your right to vote. It's a right to be a citizen. And you hand, that's part of the reason you vote for someone is for them to take care of the damn problem. You know?
This goes back to something you said earlier, which I wanted to ask you about. You referred to a lot of these people as non-voters, as like that's their category. They're not Trump voters. They're not like no, they're just non-voters. Why are they non-voters?
Cynicism.
Yeah,
cynicism. I call it justified cynicism. It's like, I think about the number of people I met, and the ones that strike me in particular are the African American ones because it's hard to push back at them. Who they're much more blunt about it. About why they didn't vote in 2016. And they're like, I forget the exact wording. Variations of the fact, there was a guy in Youngstown, I think it was, who was like, I forget the exact wording was, African-American guy, 52, my age roughly. It was like, we had a black president for 8 years and nothing's changed here on this block. And this block was all black. The potholes are still there. He's doing well. Speaking of Obama, or the guy in Lumberton, North Carolina, North Carolina, who didn't vote. And he's like, and I put it on Twitter recently. I forget the exact quote again, which was, it's, Clinton, Obama, Bush, it's all the same. There was this, sense of like, who cares? Like nothing's changing, man. Like Lumberton lost its textile mills in the 80s to Mexico to 70s, it's been going downhill since. And it's 1/3 Mexican, it's 1/3, it's very interesting. It's 1/3 Native American, 1/3 African American, 1/3 white. And it actually went from, it was an Obama place, voted for Obama twice, and voted for Trump. So it's what I call an OOT county.
Yes.
But two things happened. A lot of the minorities didn't turn out. To the level they did for Obama. Some of that was just Obama had such a large increase. But the other part was just people like the man I met who just like, why?
Yeah, they've lost faith.
But that I call that justified cynicism because a lot of people are going to say, well, your vote doesn't matter. No, it doesn't. My vote doesn't matter. Your vote doesn't matter. Everybody knows that. No election's been won by one vote. It's a singular act that you hope in aggregate. And so it's easy for us to delude ourselves into thinking your vote matters. But when things haven't changed, your vote doesn't matter.
So I guess something that...
And they know that.
Yeah.
And I apologize. But it's just like... And then the other thing is a lot of people don't want to... I liken the politics to... I use the NFL, right? Which is like... This is like an inside the NFL Sunday morning show right now.
Yeah,
right.
Same ratings too.
Twitter's like a Jets-Bills game parking lot.
Yes.
Most people are like how most people treat the NFL, which is they'll tune in once a year to watch a game for 4 hours, maybe. They'll spend about a time like that's how people treat politics a lot. They don't pay much attention, and I know people push back and say, well, they should. Well, yeah, they should, but they don't. And also, like, life's complicated, man. And it just feels like these problems, NAFTA, all these debates we're having. Was it China? Was it NAFTA? Was it technology? That's so distant from their lives. They just know that something happened in D.C. that screwed their town, that took their factory away. And when they said, hey, man, what about our jobs?
Yeah.
You say, oh, it's better for you, or here's a targeted program. You can go to community college for 4 years and learn how to code, or you should probably just rent a U-Haul and go to, it's like, leave
the family plot behind and just go.
I remember one of the things that I always remember is it was in a Waffle House in somewhere in Louisiana, and was afternoon, and it was two very back row African American kid and a white girl working. It was just me and them, and I was just listening to their conversation, and they were just talking about life. And he might have been 28, I don't know, and she might have been 24. And I remember him saying he was a little upset because, like, you know, he's talking about the drama he had recently in his life. And he's, you know, because there's like an online fantasy game called Pathfinder, I think.
Yeah.
And so it was really funny for me because him and all the McDonald's, the Walmart employees had gotten together for a Thursday night Pathfinder game, and somehow it turned into drama that got into work, and they couldn't do it anymore, and he was upset. You know, I love life, some things like that, like the Thursday night Waffle House Pathfinder game, the drama. But I remember him saying something like, and she turned to him and was like saying, like, you know, well, what do you want to do? Like, you know, like, why you? He goes, I just want a job that gives me enough money to buy a house, have a family, and then spend a little bit of time on my hobbies. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of Americans.
Yeah,
that's all they want, and that's all they. What's wrong with that?
Nothing.
So I think the thing that, and I liked your point earlier about how a huge problem on the right is sort of the libertarianism. So I don't want to echo libertarians too much when I ask you this, but what about personal responsibility? Right? So because I say that sarcastically, but I mean it seriously in this case, because we've talked about ways that front row America, through their control of systems and expectations and frankly cultural norms, has caused all these problems. But what do these people who are faced with cynicism and a lack of, I'm concerned we're giving them a lack of agency to improve their lives.
So it's funny when it gets down to the core of my views, when me and like J.D. Vance will sit down and argue, like we share a lot in common, despite being very politically, but where we'll just come to impasse will be that question.
Okay.
Which is, I'm a classic leftist, and I think people respond, people behave based on the political structures they find themselves in. And it's all about personal responsibility. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that him and
that's
a lot
what
of
it comes down to.
Right. So and this is where I get very frustrated with the left currently. When I was doing my work in the Bronx, the left loved me because I was showing that minorities and addiction is a function of the political structure that the people in the South Bronx, it's racism, structural racism, which keeps which allocates, which forces minorities into communities with secondary everything. Secondary job opportunities, secondary education, secondary all that. So when you look in that framework, you look at the social problems in these communities as being a function of the political structures. But when you do that to white communities, the left freaks out, which is to say that people, when you look at addiction in white communities or how people vote as a function of the political structures they find themselves operating in, then currently the left tends to look at that and say that's a personal responsibility, as opposed to saying let's look at the world they operate in, let's look at the unfair system they face, etc., as being as basically being responsible for a lot of the issues we see in these communities. So I just have a different view.
Yeah, fair.
I think at the very core, in aggregate, when you look at a group of people, I'm very loath to ever. I will never blame atavistic behavior. When you look at a group of people doing something you don't like, to assign it to laziness, like the right used to do to minority communities. There's so many people in poverty because they're just lazy, or idiocy, or weaknesses. I think you're doing it. I think that you're doing it wrong, and you should instead look at the political structures they operate in.
Okay, so this has been really great so far. You've given us, I think, a diagnosis. We have a theory of the case here. What is the takeaway? Because Hudson, we're a think tank. We're interested in policy here. Is it more online education? Is it more subsidies for community colleges? Like, what is your takeaway?
See, that's the biggest fault people find in the book is I don't offer policy solutions, because I think the problems are actually larger than policy. I think the problems are, and I don't have a solution to this, which is so frustrating, which is I think we as a society are very divided between the intellectual elite and the people who are not allowed to be intellectual elite. And what we find valuable in life. And again, I think I would like the front row because and the reason I have suggestions for the front row more than the back row is the front row is in power.
Yeah.
They control stuff. They make the rules.
Yeah.
So my suggestion to the front row is to get out of your bubble and to try to understand the lived reality. Because I think you all listeners, if you're front row, are well intended. I think you're doing the right things. I have no qualms with how you live. I have no qualms. I just think that you don't fully understand how bad the situation is. Some of you do, and I apologize for lumping you in that category. How bad the situation is, and how, in some cases, the solutions we offer are patronizing. The whole idea of you're voting against your self-interest, as if you, the listener, knows better about somebody's own self-interest. That's very patronizing. So go there and listen and ask them what is their own interest, and then maybe reconfigure the system to allow other forms of meaning. So, if I actually had to come up with policy solutions, the biggest one I can think of is simplicity, man. Complex rules, bureaucracy harms the poor in awful ways. Simplify the system, simplify the social safety net, increase the social safety net, but simplify it.
Well, I think that's no better note to end on. I think that really does come down to, the core difference. But ultimately, with your diagnosis, you've offered us, I think, a good view for people in the front row to at least try and understand what it's like in the back and maybe question some of the assumptions that they have going forward in their day-to-day lives and maybe how they look at the 2020 election. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.